Thank you all. Obviously, if you've been coming, you know that I'm filling in today for Chuck. They're visiting some family up in Tennessee, I believe, and I'll try to keep the pace up with what he's been doing. Been doing an excellent job, and I got to say, it's very rewarding to look into a study like this. You know, those of us who have been involved with worship and Bible classes have been hearing these stories all our lives, but I got to say that preparing for this has revealed some things to me that I've never heard before or never realized before from the text, and really kind of helped shape our understanding of God's will for us further. And I hope I can pass some of that stuff along for you this morning as we cover these things. We'll be doing a brief review of some of what Chuck's already covered in the first few chapters of Exodus, and then we will also get into the plagues a little deeper. He started into those last week, and interestingly, we've had some supplemental lessons from both Ryan and Jeremy on this in the last few weeks, so we ought to be really well versed, at least with some of the plagues, as well as Pharaoh and his attitude, and some of the warnings we get from his character. And I will touch on some of those this morning as well. But before we get into that, let's bow and go to our God in prayer. God, our Heavenly Father, we bow before your throne this morning. We're so thankful, Lord, to be your people. We're thankful that we have this day established by you to remember your Son and the sacrifice that he made on our behalf. And Lord, because of our sin, he had to shed his blood and give his life so that we could be in fellowship with you. What a great blessing, dear God. And you have been there for your people since before creation. You had a plan. And ever since you've created us, you have been there, even when your people were going astray, and you have built people up. And you have taken other individuals that lived and used their character to establish your will and to demonstrate your power in the world. And as we look into these lessons, especially from the book of Exodus this morning, help us to realize that although these things happened many, many years ago, that the same principles that you used to deal with your people then, as well as the people that opposed you, apply today. And help us to not ever forget that we also can at times oppose you, and the very warnings that you give towards your enemies in the scriptures we need to take heed of as well. Help us to see your great power. Help us to later on this morning glorify you for that power and for the love you've shown us. And help us, Lord, as we look into this study, to glean things that will truly change our lives, and help us to have a renewed focus as we enter into this upcoming week. We're thankful for you and for all that you do for us and for the opportunities you give us. And please bless us this morning and help us to worship you with a pure heart. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, just briefly, I wanted to make a couple of points before we get into the plagues. One of the things that has been on my mind a lot lately, and it's just an interesting conversation. It's not that I can prove or disprove anything, but I've been considering the nature of worship to God back in these days from the beginning of time. And we know that people followed God's instructions, evident from early times. We know that they went against God's instructions, and they had to pay for that at times. And we see at times that individuals offered sacrifices. We know that from as far back as Cain and Abel. Abraham, we read about those sacrifices they made to God to glorify him. But we don't know much about any other requirements that God had for his people, at least none that are really documented. And if you know of any, please share those at this time or with me later, because it's an interesting thought. But as we look into this story, we see an interesting situation, and I know Chuck covered this already, where God meets Moses and his wife Zipporah and their kid along the way as he's heading towards Egypt. And he sought to kill him. And at the end of the story, Zipporah circumcises, I assume it's Gershom, their child. And she's a little put off by the idea, evidently. But I think the moral of that message is that God still expected his people to be circumcised. So that's one of the rules, if you will, that God's people had, even from the earliest days with Abraham, and still existed in this time. And because Moses had not done that, he was going to have to pay. But God's will was carried out. But as we consider that, we're entering into a point where God is going to reveal his law to the people shortly after they leave from Egypt. And so it's just an interesting time as we consider. We're not real sure what they did as far as service or worship to God, but we're going to find out soon what God expects of his people. Also, just a side note, I don't know what substance there is to this, but as I was considering the plagues, I look at the first plague, and Chuck covered this, where the water is turned to blood throughout Egypt, even to the smallest pool in Egypt, the water was turned to blood. So that was the first plague. And then the last plague included blood as well, with the Passover, the blood having to be applied to the posts around the door. And, we understand that there's a significance with blood all along. We understand that we are washed clean by the blood of Christ, that sacrifice that he made. So to God, there's a special significance with blood. I don't know, again, if it has anything to do with the bookends of these plagues, but interesting to note that the first plague and the last include blood, and all those in between include natural calamities. They were certainly not natural in the way they happened, but all of them involved different animals or different events that would happen naturally in the world, but they were rained down upon the Egyptians to the point that we now refer to them as plagues. So again, just an interesting note as we look at this. And then also as we get to this portion of the story, we see that God notifies clearly, or he has Moses notify clearly Pharaoh of what is going to happen. And he tells them in chapter 9 and verse 16, if y'all want to turn over there and read with me. But indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. So God has a purpose here. He also tells Pharaoh over in chapter 4, if we read in verses 22 and 23, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. But if you refuse to let him go, indeed, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So, and we understand as we look at this, and y'all are going to see sort of a broken record as we look at these plagues, as you probably already know, that they God rains down plagues upon the Egyptians, and Pharaoh waffles. He realizes he's in trouble. He tells Moses what he wants to hear, that he's going to let the people go. And in fact, he hardens his heart in every single case. And so, again, don't get bored with that as we go through this, but God told Moses, Pharaoh's not going to listen. He's going to hold on to your people, but I'm going to deliver my people with a mighty hand. And he was going to use Moses as his mouthpiece, but he was also going to use Pharaoh as his instrument of doing that. So real quick, considering Pharaoh, and again, some of this is repeat what y'all have already seen, but just to give a background, we see a lot of events that happen, and in these next couple of slides, I wanted to summarize, what Pharaoh was doing, and then the effects, and then what Moses was doing, and how God dealt with that in these next couple of things. But as y'all already know, that Pharaoh, even before Moses came to him, he realized that the children of Israel were growing strong. They were a large nation. They were multiplying greatly, so he went about using various schemes to subdue them. He was a politician. He was a king over a very mighty nation, and he had no doubt earned his spot there. He had probably subdued many other kingdoms. But we see that he puts his taskmasters over the children of Israel, and we know this story, that they were treated as slaves. They were required to do rigorous labor. They were making bricks is one of the trades that we know that they were heavily involved in. and he went about various methods to make that work harder, which kind of flies in the face for those of you in the building trade. When you hire contractors or when you have people working for you, you want to help them make their job better, to make your job better. But that wasn't Pharaoh's idea. Pharaoh's idea was first and foremost to keep his nation secure, and he was threatened by the people of Israel with their great numbers. But you see in this first point, and these kind of go across, he put the taskmasters over them to inflict them with bondage, but the more they were afflicted, the more they multiplied and grew. We see that in these first couple of chapters of Exodus. Then he goes to the point of going to the midwives who evidently were involved in delivering the children from the Hebrew women. And he tells them that when a son is born, he's to be killed. That the daughters are fine, you can let them survive, but the sons have to be killed. But we see here that the midwives feared God. I want to read some verses in chapter 1. Let's read verses 17 through 21, and let me get these out because I'll be able to see better. But the midwives, starting in verse 17 of chapter 1, but the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing and saved the male children alive? And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. So again, Pharaoh makes an effort here to subdue the growth of the children of Israel, and the effect is that even the people that he orders to do things, they fear God, and they're rewarded because of it in this reading. After that, he just commands that all male children be thrown into the Nile. And then we see that Moses was born, and we start reading about Moses in chapter 2. And we know that story. His mother, didn't want to follow Pharaoh's rule, as any mother wouldn't have. But she puts him in a basket, puts him on the river, and ends up, he is found by Pharaoh's daughter, who happened to be bathing in that section of the Nile. And then we know that she ends up taking Moses in, and actually hires his mother to nurse him and to raise him, so to speak, in his early years. And then she ends up calling him her son. So that tactic probably worked. We don't really have a record of how many Israelite children were killed during this time, but at least Moses was saved. And we understand, as we're going to study more, he becomes really a critical figure throughout the scriptures. We talk about him today still, obviously. That Pharaoh died, and then we know of at least one other. So we're going to talk about at least two Pharaohs today. We had the one that was here in chapter 1, but then we understand that he died in chapter 2. But when he died, this groaning that the children of Israel were doing, the oppression that they were experiencing, did not cease. The taskmasters were still troubling them, still forcing them to rigorous labor. And at this point, in chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, we see, so God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. We know that it wasn't all of a sudden God realized they were being oppressed. God knew all the time what was going on, but we see this point in time, a point of inflection, if you will. God is now going to take some direct steps to begin to deliver his children, and he's going to use Moses in that way to do that. And as we read in chapter 3 and verse 8, God says, so I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptian and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. We read that phrase, that covenant, I would call it, throughout the Old Testament, that God had promised his people as far back as Abraham that they were going to inhabit this land where these nations already existed. But you got to think that the people at that time, as they were being treated so poorly, probably didn't give much heed. And in fact, we'll read about that in a minute, that they didn't give much thought to, because they were so subdued and so oppressed by the Egyptians they couldn't see any hope from that. They didn't get that God had something great in store for them, really a reward of sorts in store for them. And we see that was tough for them to gain confidence that God was going to deliver them. And, we could probably put ourselves in that position too. If we're being treated the way we were or the way that they were, I think it might be natural, even though we hope not, but we would kind of call out and think, God, why is this happening to us? And many of us in here can understand that. It can be a battle at times when we're experiencing tough things in life. So we can refer back to these stories, though, and that's the great thing, that we understand that God is with us. Even in the toughest of times, God's with us. He has a plan, and if we're to stick by, we can be recipients of that reward. So a little bit more about Pharaoh specifically. He, and this was at least the second Pharaoh since chapter 1 that we read about, and this is, some 40 years later. Moses was evidently in Midian around 40 years. He comes out, and we meet this other Pharaoh. He wasn't any kind of novice leader, and we can see through the way that he treats the interaction with Moses and with Eran that he had some savvy about him, and he knew how to deal with diplomacy, if you will, if you want to call it that. He was pretty ruthless in his dealings, but you can see his methods, and they tend to kind of work, as we'll get to here in a minute. But Pharaoh could have been blessed. Let's think back in relatively, it had been, a few hundred years since Joseph's time at this point, but the land of Egypt was blessed because of Joseph, because of the children of Israel, because of God, because of God's relationship with Joseph. These pharaohs could have received blessings. They could have flourished had they not been treating God's people so poorly. But we understand and we see the wickedness of Pharaoh's heart. And I won't re-preach Ryan's sermon from a couple weeks ago, but we understand that, as we'll read here in a minute, that Pharaoh hardened his heart quite often, and then the verbiage will change to God hardened Pharaoh's heart, that God was using Pharaoh again to carry out his plan. And even though Pharaoh was a very wicked man, untrustworthy, God still was able to use him to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. All right, real quick, let's shift to Moses. And I wanted to, when I got into this, and again, I think we probably talked about these too, but I wanted to summarize what indicates or what shows us what the character of Moses was at this time. As we see here on the left side, we see some of the comments that Moses makes, kind of arguing with God or really questioning God as to why him, why me, why would you pick me to lead the people out? Starting in chapter 3 and verse 11, we see, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And then we see right after that, verse 12, God's response, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So God tells Moses, he tells him what's going to happen. He gives him a prophecy, if you will, but he knew what was going to happen in these upcoming months and years. We see that here, and he's just trying to assure Moses. So move on down in chapter 4, verse 1, we see that Moses answered and said, but suppose they will not believe me or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you. And we understand, and I know Chuck did cover this too, that God's response to that was to say, what's in your hand? And the story with the rods, he throws down the rod, it becomes a snake, so a miraculous event happens. Also, he tells Moses to put his hand into his bosom. He takes it out and it's covered with leprosy. And he says, put it back. He puts it back and brings it out, and it's been healed or it's clean. So these two miraculous things we see, it wasn't just Pharaoh that needed to be convinced of God's power. Moses, too, needed to be convinced that, hey, it's not you, it's me. And I think this goes hand in hand with some of what we've heard related to these lessons is that, we can say that all day. I'm not good enough, or I don't know enough. I can't influence other people. But the fact is, it's not us. We're just a messenger. We're just an example. God is the one that's doing the work. And when God's doing something and he has a plan for it, nothing's going to keep it from happening. So again, these stories have to build us up. We have to be reminded of this as we look into these things. Chapter 4, verse 10, Moses keeps on with the excuses. Thus Moses saith to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before nor since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. I've wondered about that. Moses may have had some speech impediment for all we know, or he may have just been making excuses. He may have been able to speak fine. He was just making excuses. I tend to believe maybe he had a stutter some way, but if you consider, he's thinking about going in front of maybe one of the most mighty men in the world at that time to negotiate with him, if you will, or to reason with him, to plead with him. And, we would want to, if we're going in to see the president, we're going to want to put on our best face. We're going to want to speak fluently, eloquently. Moses didn't think he had that. But we see here in verses 14 through 16, so the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. Look, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Verses 11, 12, I skipped those, but God tells Moses, I'm going to be with your mouth. He says, and this is something that's good to be reminded. God says to him, who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I, the Lord? You think God didn't know what Moses' ability to speak was? And do you think God didn't have power over that? Even if he had a lisp or something, God could have used that to convince Pharaoh. But again, we see Moses needing to be convinced, needing to gain some confidence before he goes and does these things. So he's throwing up these excuses. And really, this is before he kind of agrees or goes to do the work. These are the excuses that I saw beforehand. We read a couple of others here in these last two examples of after they go and start negotiating with Pharaoh. It didn't go as well as Moses thought it should have gone. So in chapter 5, verse 22, we see, so Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? Again, he questioned before he was sent. When he was sent, things didn't happen. Things didn't happen the way he thought they should have. And he immediately goes and starts questioning God. But we see God respond to that. Chapter 6, verse 1, then the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of this land. So the odds are stacked against the Israelites in any man's eyes. Moses thought so, the people thought so. But God, again, had a plan. And he's reminding Moses, and he's reminding us that when the odds are stacked, just wait. You just wait. His will is going to happen. We see in chapter 6, verse 12, and in verse 30, Moses uses this phrase, I'm of uncircumcised lips. I think another version says unskilled lips. I think about Isaiah with that one when he is called to, agrees to go and represent God. He's of uncircumcised lips. But at this point, it sounds like God has just kind of had it. And he just says, he speaks to Moses in chapter 6, verse 13. He spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a command for the children of Israel and for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. He just says, just go do it. And so we get God's frustration, but we can also relate. We should be able to relate to Moses' trepidation there, not having the confidence to go and do this. And I think it's interesting to note, I don't know if we'll have time to get to it, the growth that we're going to see in Moses. I mean, we see him as a man making excuses here, but we are quickly going to see him flourish into a leader, and we understand through the course of time that he really made his mark in history as a man of faith, a man who relied upon God. But these events right now are what are shaping that for him. So one of the things when I was reading through these and considering Pharaoh and considering his attitude, and again I mentioned he had some savvy about him. He wasn't a novice. He leading the nation that he was leading. He had to have had some skill. And I think about him as he looks at the people of Israel. And the older Pharaoh in chapter 1 was concerned that the size of the nation might join forces with an invading nation or with an opposing nation and help them to overcome the Egyptians. They were a strong nation. Now at this situation where we see Moses coming in and dealing with Pharaoh, Pharaoh's going to take a little bit of a different approach, although it's the same approach with the taskmasters and the rigorous work they're going to require the children of Israel. But he understands when he sees Moses and Aaron come in that this is a formidable host as he's always known, but we're going to see him do some things that are going to divide Moses from the people. So if you consider an enemy commanding army or a commander of an army, if that's your enemy, you want to create some dissension in their ranks. And we see that happen with Pharaoh and some of the acts that he does. And as I called this, his shrewdness, as the word was used in chapter 1, his shrewdness here is revealed. In chapter 5, verse 1, God, through Moses, says, let my people go and hold a feast to me. And Pharaoh's response is, who is the Lord? Who is it? Really he's thinking, I'm God. The people saw him as a God. And I'm not going to let them go. You can't tell me what to do. Verse 3, Moses and Aaron go on and say, the God of Hebrews has met with us, and he requires us to go out and sacrifice to him, even going so far as to say that persecution may come upon us if we don't do that. And it's interesting to see what Pharaoh's response is here. Just in general, for those of you who may have read forward, what is Pharaoh's general response at these early negotiations with Moses and Aaron? Sir?
Get the Israelites back to work and you ain't got time to go.
Get back to work. You're lazy. You're idle, as you'll see on this right column over here. Get back to your labor. And it's very interesting to see. Let's read chapter 5, verse 15. Then the officers of the children of Israel came and cried out to Pharaoh, saying, why are you dealing thus with your servants? Not only were the taskmasters beating them, but they also took away one of their key ingredients to making the bricks and required them to go out to find the straw to make the bricks that they originally were supplying. The Egyptians were supplying that, but not only did they remove that resource from them, required them to go get it, they also required them to maintain the same quota of bricks per day that they were having to make. So you can understand that the officers and the people of Israel were stacked up. They were in trouble. They didn't know how they were going to achieve what Pharaoh was requiring of them. So they're really being put into a predicament. In verse 17 of chapter 5 again, Pharaoh, but he said, you are idle. Therefore, you say, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. So you see here, Pharaoh turns what Moses and Aaron are coming in and pleading with him to let them do. He's turning it and representing that as the reason the people are having to work harder. Y'all are idle. That's the only reason y'all want to go and to sacrifice to your God. Whether he believed, obviously the people were working, and he was the one stacking the deck against them. So he knew that wasn't what was going on. But again, it seems like a tactic that he was drawing a division between Moses and Aaron or any of the other leaders and then the people. He didn't want them united. Them consolidated means trouble. So he does a good job here and even gets through and has Moses questioning. Again, I read this verse a minute ago, but again in verse 22 of chapter 5, so Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Why is it you have sent me? So Pharaoh had success in this effort. He had divided the people effectively. So again, there was no unity there. And that would work against most nations, right? But the thing that Pharaoh didn't know, and we all understand, is that it wasn't a mere man that was leading these people. He couldn't use the same tactics and schemes he would use against other nations to subdue them. He had God he was dealing with and continuing with here, even though he didn't realize it. And as we've repeated, God's plan was not going to fail. We're going to read over and over about Oh, sorry, I'm not.
We advance a little bit further on.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Whoever's. So we're going to read over and over again about Pharaoh hardening his heart. God knows that Pharaoh will not let the children go. Over in chapter 3, verse 19, God says, "But I'm sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go, no, not even by a mighty hand." We've read a couple of other verses that show that God knew that Pharaoh was not going to let the people go. So I'm gonna move on past this one so we can get into the plagues. Before we get into the specific plagues, and again, I know we have this slide you already saw on the next one. Does anybody have any comments up to this point?
You know, Moses had the same attitude that we have quite often. He told God there in the last verse of chapter 5, neither had you delivered your people at all. God had told him he's going to deliver them. And Moses wanted him to deliver them right now.
Right then, yeah.
But God had a plan. He had these plagues planned all along. And that's our attitude quite often. God, I want you to do something for me, but I want you to do it right now. And we're trying to take God's place. We're trying to do his job for him. God doesn't react to that, and he didn't react to that the way Moses wanted to. Moses wanted him to just snap his fingers and the children were gone. That's not God's plan.
Sure, yeah, and what he was saying was Moses was more or less impatient. He didn't want to wait on God's plan, or he probably didn't even really understand God's plan. But he probably thought that, hey, as soon as we show these rods, these miraculous things where the rods turn into serpents or the leprosy on the hand, we wouldn't, the plagues wouldn't even be necessary. That Pharaoh would see the works and immediately let him go. But certainly we don't see that. And his magicians, they're called soothsayers, some versions call them, were involved in this as well. They were able to pull off a couple of these stunts, which may have swayed Pharaoh to harden his heart more, not really recognizing the power that he was witnessing at the time. But we see here he's going to have to endure 10 plagues to endure before he actually wakes up. And then again, his heart remains hard even after that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Looking ahead, you got to realize God set the stage because he's got to convince the Israelites who he is too. They don't have a grasp of who God is. See, through their travels in the wilderness, he's teaching them who he is, to have faith in him. That's all got to be set up.
Yeah, so God was not only convincing Pharaoh, which doesn't seem like he really convinces him, but he's convincing Moses, he's convincing the children of Israel. The other thing I failed to mention in the introduction is we don't know what kind of religion they were practicing when they were slaves. We know that the Egyptians were polytheistic. They had a god for everything, and they were no doubt exposed to that, maybe even required to participate in that to some extent while they were in bondage. So their knowledge of God, their knowledge of that promise that we read a minute ago, that they were going to be taken into the promised land, may have been non-existent in some of them. We don't really know, but we understand that they're having to learn who God is as well. And we see this as the problem throughout their history that we're about to see, is that they constantly are waffling and saying they're wanting to go back to Egypt and comparing God in service to him to this service they had endured in Egypt. And there's no comparison, obviously, but we understand they lack faith. They lack belief in a lot of cases. Okay, moving on. The water turned to blood and the frogs. We talked about this, so I'm going to kind of surf through this a little bit. One of the things that I want to share, if you consider the people and all the frogs that were there, the frogs did indicate a level of fertility. And, when they hear frogs, they understand that the Nile is there, that they have habitat, that there are these alluvial plains around the river where they exist and flourish. So when the frogs come out as a plague, it's kind of a sign of God using their God, if you will, against them and showing his power over them. So really we see that in all the plagues, that God's power over the natural world, it flies in the face of what they believe, that these individuals, they had a god that was a frog and many other animal gods, if you will, that represented various things in their agricultural lifestyle. So the third, we see gnats. We see them throw dust out and it turns into gnats. Moses and Aaron do. These gnats, or lice is what the New King James calls it. I don't know. I'd read somewhere that they were biting insects. I don't know. That was something that Chuck had given. I'm not sure where exactly that came from. But we see this is the first plague that the magicians could not duplicate. And we see them telling Pharaoh, look, this is the finger of God. We can't do this. This is the finger of God involved here. So these gnats were no doubt a nuisance. And y'all know if you have fruit that's ripening in your house, gnats are terrible. These insects, again, not sure exactly what they were doing, but a major nuisance to the point that, Pharaoh at least says that he wants to change and let the people go. I'm convinced at this point that he was playing games the whole time, but he hardened his heart. And again, he just kind of flirted with letting them go. But as soon as they ask God to remove the plague, his heart hardens. And then we see the second plague, that he sends swarming flies upon them, and they're everywhere. They're all over the servants. They're all over their homes. But we see here that God does separate the land of Goshen. People of Israel didn't have to endure this plague. I don't know if they did the earlier ones. Obviously, the water turned to blood would have affected them. But at this point, we see that God gives a geographic boundary to the plague. So, Pharaoh could have kind of thought, well, this is just a, environmental thing going on. But the fact that there was probably a really nice line between where all the flies were and where they weren't, where the people of Israel were, that there was another more mighty hand involved here. And we'll see that in upcoming plagues as well, that, the people of Israel were not affected by them the way the Egyptians were. But again, Pharaoh says, I'll let the people go. And as soon as Moses goes out and asks God to remove the plague, he hardens his heart. Y'all can read further into that. I'll let Chuck pick up in there. We didn't get as far as probably he wanted us to, but hopefully we got a start on those plagues. If y'all want to read on through chapter 12 or so, and including the Passover, I know he's going to want to spend some time on the 10th plague and the Passover. So thank y'all for your attention this morning.